A hostess mocks a quiet stranger on a yacht. Seconds later, the entire party freezes. The afternoon sun hung high above the horizon, spilling its golden light across the endless expanse of the sea. The water shimmered like scattered jewels, each wave reflecting fragments of brilliance that danced and flickered beneath the gentle breeze. Against this backdrop of calm elegance floated a grand white yacht, its polished deck gleaming as though it had been carved from ivory, its towering masts cutting an impressive silhouette against the sky. From a distance, it seemed like a palace adrift upon the ocean, a symbol of wealth, exclusivity, and untouchable privilege. On board, the yacht was alive with sound and movement. A soft rhythm of jazz spilled from hidden speakers, blending with the chatter of voices and the occasional burst of laughter that rose above the music. Crystal flutes of champagne glistened in the sun, held delicately in manicured hands. Women in flowing gowns, adorned with glittering jewelry, leaned into conversations that mixed shallow amusement with hidden competition. Men in tailored suits laughed too loudly at one another's jokes, clinking glasses in a performance of camaraderie that felt as fragile as the glassware itself. Everything about the gathering was polished, curated, almost staged, the perfect portrait of affluence. Waiters in white uniforms moved gracefully among the guests, balancing silver trays that carried delicate hors d'oeuvres and fresh drinks. Perfume hung in the air, mingling with the salt of the sea breeze, a contradiction of natural purity and human vanity. Every detail spoke of wealth: the shoes that had never touched a grain of sand, the jewelry that caught the sun like small captured stars, the conversations that seemed more about being heard than truly understood. Yet, beneath all the glittering surfaces was something subtler, a quiet arrogance, an unspoken agreement that this place, this floating palace, was not for everyone. It was a space where wealth defined worth, where appearance commanded respect. And then, from the edge of the deck, a figure stepped aboard. He did not arrive with fanfare, nor did he seek attention with flamboyant gestures or flashy attire. Instead, he moved with a quiet certainty, as though he belonged to the sea and to the yacht upon it. He was a black man in his early 40s, his posture straight, his presence composed. His suit was sharp, cut clean to fit his frame, yet modest compared to the extravagance of those around him. There was no glint of a gold watch on his wrist, no gaudy chain at his neck, no obvious symbol to announce his place in this world of luxury. And yet, there was something undeniable about him. His eyes, dark and steady, swept across the deck not in awe, but in quiet observation. He noticed everything: the flicker of judgment in a guest's narrowed gaze, the shallow smile of a man already calculating his social worth, the hostess whose laughter rang just a little too sharp. He absorbed it all, not with insecurity, but with patience, as though he were reading a book he had already memorized. Guests noticed him too. A woman in a sequined gown tilted her head, eyes narrowing with curiosity. A man lowered his champagne flute, whispering something to his companion while nodding in the stranger's direction. Subtle glances darted toward him, measuring, questioning. He did not fit the image they had crafted in their minds of who should be here, and that fact unsettled them, but he remained unshaken. His stride across the deck was slow, deliberate, his chin lifted not with arrogance but with certainty. He was not a man begging for recognition, nor one who sought to prove himself. He carried himself as though he had nothing to prove at all. The sunlight touched the lines of his face, revealing not just age but experience, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud. His expression was calm, composed, a mask of dignity that both concealed and revealed at once. Though his suit was simple compared to the opulence around him, it seemed to wear him with more elegance than the tailored costumes of those trying so desperately to impress. Around him the laughter continued, but softer now, as if the very presence of this man had shifted the air. Conversations faltered for a heartbeat before resuming, though the words felt less certain, more watchful. The music played on, but beneath it, Something had changed, an invisible current moving quietly through the crowd. The man reached the center of the deck and paused. He did not smile, nor did he frown. Instead, he allowed the silence within himself to meet the noise around him. It was a moment so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, but for those who looked closely, it was clear. Here was a man who carried a weight no one else could see. A man who walked not into another's world, but into his own. The grand yacht, the glittering guests, the endless sea, all of it seemed to bend ever so slightly around his presence. For though he came without flash or spectacle, he carried within him an authority greater than gold, a strength quieter than power, yet infinitely more enduring. And though the crowd did not yet know who he was, the sea itself seemed to know. The moment he stepped fully onto the deck, the air shifted again, not in sound, but in perception. Eyes followed him, questions unspoken but heavy in their weight. It didn't take long before one gaze sharpened more than the rest. From across the deck, a young hostess spotted him. She was striking in her own way, draped in a sleek designer dress that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Her jewelry sparkled, her makeup was flawless, and her posture was sculpted with the kind of confidence that came from being admired often. But her beauty carried something sharper beneath the surface, a pride so practiced it had hardened into arrogance. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw him. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to wonder who he might be. In her mind, she already knew. He wasn't one of them. He didn't belong in this shimmering tableau of wealth and vanity. His modest suit, his unadorned presence, it did not fit her picture of exclusivity. Instead of greeting him with warmth, as her role should have demanded, she approached with a smile that was more weapon than welcome. It was tight, forced, the kind of smile that cut instead of comforted. Her heels clicked against the polished deck as she drew near, and when she spoke, her words dripped with practiced sweetness laced with poison. "Excuse me, sir," she began, tilting her head just slightly, the tone of her voice carrying a razor's edge. "I believe you might be lost. This is a private gathering." The words weren't merely cautionary, they were accusatory, as though his very presence were an offense. She gave him a sweeping glance from head to toe, her smirk widening ever so slightly as she added, "Unless you're part of the service crew, the catering staff usually comes through the back entrance." Nearby guests, catching the exchange, leaned in closer, their conversations faltering. Some smirked behind their glasses, amused by the subtle insult. Others looked on curiously, waiting to see how this stranger would react to being put in his place. But the man did not falter. His eyes met hers with steady calm, unflinching, as though her words passed through him without leaving a mark. He carried no hint of anger, no trace of wounded pride. Instead, he spoke with a politeness so measured it made her arrogance seem even sharper in contrast. "I assure you," he said gently, his voice smooth and even, "I'm not lost." There was a weight in his tone, not defensive, but certain, grounded in truth that needed no defense. He stood straight, his hands relaxed at his sides, his presence unshaken, despite the dismissive way she stared at him. The hostess blinked, briefly unsettled by the calm in his reply. She had expected flustered excuses, perhaps embarrassment, maybe even anger. Instead, his composure disarmed her for a split second, though she quickly masked it with another smirk. "Well," she said, adjusting her stance, her chin lifting slightly higher, "in that case, perhaps you'll allow me to direct you. This area is for invited guests only, and I'm quite certain I would know if your name were on the list." Her voice carried louder now, just enough to ensure others could hear. The man didn't bristle. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, his reply was respectful, almost gracious, but layered with something she, and those who were listening, couldn't quite place. "I appreciate your concern," he said evenly, "but perhaps it would be wise to first know who you are speaking to." His words were not delivered as a challenge, but as a suggestion, quiet, almost gentle. Yet they carried a weight that seemed to pause the air between them. His eyes, calm but steady, held hers with an authority that needed no title to declare itself. The hostess shifted, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. Around them, whispers rippled, subtle but unmistakable. Guests exchanged glances, their curiosity sharpening. Something about the man's demeanor unsettled the performance of superiority the hostess tried so desperately to maintain. Still, she forced her smile back into place, clinging to her assumption. "Of course," she said, her tone honeyed but mocking, "though I can't imagine who you think you are to speak that way here." But the man didn't reply immediately. Instead, he let silence fill the space, his calm presence contrasting with her restless arrogance. It was as though the very air waited with him, carrying a quiet assurance that her assumptions might not be as safe as she believed. In that moment, though the guests didn't yet know why, the balance of power on the deck began to shift. The tension between the man and the hostess lingered like a thin veil in the warm afternoon air. The sea continued to shimmer, the music played on, and glasses of champagne were still raised. But those nearest to the exchange could feel something was shifting. The man did not flinch under her dismissive smile. He did not raise his voice or attempt to assert himself with force. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes calm, his expression thoughtful, and asked in a tone so measured it seemed to echo louder than arrogance ever could. "Tell me," he said, his voice carrying a quiet steadiness, "do you know who owns this yacht?" The hostess blinked, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, her expression faltered before she let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was brittle, practiced a sound meant more for the audience listening nearby than for the man himself. She waved her manicured hand as though brushing away an insignificant detail. "Of course I know," she replied with an airy confidence. "It belongs to someone of status, someone far above what you might imagine. Which is why I can assure you, you should not be here." Her words were sharp, designed to cut. But the man did not react. His gaze remained steady, not harsh, not challenging, but calm in a way that made her arrogance look smaller by comparison. He let a brief silence hang between them before he asked again, his tone unchanged, though his words pierced more deeply this time. "Are you certain I should not be here?" The hostess's laugh rang louder now, deliberately theatrical. She turned slightly, as though to invite others into the performance. A few guests chuckled softly, exchanging amused glances, feeding off the tension like vultures circling overhead. To them, it was entertainment, an intruder being reminded of his place. And yet, not everyone laughed. Some guests, their glasses still poised halfway to their lips, studied the man more carefully. There was something disquieting about the way he stood, so composed, so at ease, as though the insults were nothing more than a passing breeze. His posture was not one of defiance, but of certainty that did not belong to a man sneaking into places he did not belong. Whispers began to ripple across the deck. A woman leaned toward her companion, her eyes narrowed, her voice low but urgent. "He doesn't seem out of place, does he? Look how he carries himself." Her companion frowned, torn between amusement and unease. "Strange," he admitted, "like he's not the one intruding at all. More like he's waiting." The hostess, oblivious to the seeds of doubt beginning to bloom, pressed on with her arrogance. She gestured at the man's modest suit, her voice dripping with condescension. "I mean, look at you. No offense, but this isn't exactly the crowd for modest suits and quiet faces. If you're not part of the staff, then surely you've wandered into the wrong place." The man did not so much as shift in response. His calm gaze swept briefly across the deck as though taking inventory of the guests, the decor, the very bones of the yacht itself. It was a glance of recognition, not discovery, and for those who caught it, the unease deepened. Why did he seem so familiar with everything here? Why did he look not like a man trying to fit in, but a man waiting for others to recognize him? The hostess, mistaking his silence for defeat, smiled triumphantly. "Security will be here shortly," she announced loudly, ensuring everyone within earshot could hear her. "It's best you leave before we have to make a scene." But even then, the man remained unshaken. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to her performance. He inclined his head slightly, as though granting her permission to believe her own words, and his voice, when it came again, carried no anger, only patience. "If that is what you believe," he said softly, "then perhaps we shall see." Around them, the laughter grew thinner. Some guests continued to smirk, but their smiles no longer reached their eyes. Others looked uneasy, exchanging glances as though they had missed some crucial detail. Beneath the glitter of jewelry and the clinking of glasses, something else lingered now, an undercurrent of doubt, faint but undeniable, for in the stillness of the man's composure, there was a story untold, a truth unspoken, and the longer he stood without bending to their scorn, the more the crowd began to wonder, who was this man who seemed so unbothered by humiliation? And why, in the heart of all this wealth, did it suddenly feel as though he was the only one who truly belonged? The murmur of curiosity had grown heavier in the air, but the young hostess seemed determined to crush whatever doubt had begun to spread among the guests. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished deck as she stepped closer, raising her chin high as though the sheer angle of her posture could cement her authority. She raised her voice, deliberately louder now, ensuring her words carried past the small cluster of onlookers and into the wider crowd scattered across the deck. "Well," she said, her tone laced with a theatrical kind of pity, "this little charade has gone on long enough, hasn't it?" Her smile was tight, artificial, her eyes gleaming with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had cornered her prey. Guests turned, champagne flutes hovering mid-air, conversations faltering into silence. The man stood where he was, his hands folded loosely in front of him, posture dignified yet unassuming. The hostess let out a brittle laugh. "Look at him," she continued, gesturing toward his suit with a dramatic wave. "Trying so desperately to blend in with real millionaires. Did you really think no one would notice?" A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, though it was uneven. Some guests laughed too loudly, eager to align themselves with her confidence. Others chuckled nervously, masking their discomfort. And still, there were those who only stared, uneasy at how unbothered the man remained under the sting of public ridicule. His face did not betray anger nor shame. His calm was unyielding. The hostess, interpreting his silence as weakness, pressed harder. She took a step closer, her voice rising, as though each word were another lash meant to drive him out. "You know what this is?" she said, her gaze sweeping across the audience now gathered. "It's desperation. People like him think they can slip into circles like ours, pretend for a while, maybe even trick someone into believing they belong. But let me assure you, no amount of confidence can hide the truth." Her words echoed, harsh and cruel, carried by the sea breeze across the deck. The man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her as though she were no more than a child playing at authority. The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips, not one of amusement, but of quiet patience, a smile that held a truth no one else yet understood. The hostess, unsettled by that subtle expression, hardened her voice further. "Enough of this. Nonsense. Security." From the edge of the deck, two uniformed men moved forward, their expressions professional but hesitant. Even they seemed caught in the strange gravity of the moment, their steps slower than expected. "Escort this man off." "The yacht," the hostess commanded, her voice sharp and final. The man did not resist. He did not argue, nor did he offer protest. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture of such graceful acceptance that it silenced a few stray chuckles. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped aside to give the guards space. As he moved toward the exit, the murmurs of the crowd swelled again, mixing with small bursts of laughter. To them, it was a conclusion, an intruder caught and expelled, a story to tell later with the satisfaction of being present for the spectacle. But as the man paused at the edge of the deck, something shifted. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the yacht one final time. It was not the look of a defeated guest being driven away. It was the look of someone examining his own property, quiet ownership woven into every subtle detail of his expression. He did not speak. He did not need to. That single glance, steady and assured, carried more weight than words ever could. The hostess crossed her arms, triumphant. To her, it was victory. To the guests, it was humiliation complete. They chuckled, they whispered, some shaking their heads at the audacity of the stranger who dared to step among them, and yet a thin thread of doubt tugged at a few of their minds. Why did he leave so willingly? Why did his final look not resemble shame but possession? The music swelled again, the moment slipping into the background as though nothing more than another distraction in the gilded spectacle of the afternoon. But beneath the laughter, beneath the clinking of crystal and the glitter of sunlight on the sea, something unspoken remained, lingering like a shadow. The story, though they did not yet know. It was far from over. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, softening its brilliance into golden hues that shimmered across the sea. The music swelled again, trying to reclaim the atmosphere of indulgence that had briefly fractured. Glasses clinked, laughter returned. In patches, but beneath it all was a faint unease, a whisper of something unresolved. Then, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through. The event coordinator, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy blazer, burst onto the deck, his expression taut with urgency. He scanned the gathering, his brow furrowed, his movements quick and restless as though searching for someone desperately important. Several guests turned toward him, curious. The hostess, still basking in her supposed victory, tilted her head and smirked. "Darling, what's the rush? You look as though you've lost something." The coordinator didn't even glance her way. His voice carried firmly, slicing through the hum of chatter. "Where is Mr. Williams?" he demanded. The crowd stilled. A few exchanged puzzled looks. Others frowned, replaying the words in their minds as though they had misheard. The coordinator's voice grew sharper, tinged with alarm. "Mr. James Williams, the host of this event, the owner of this yacht, where is he?" The hostess laughed, though it was thin, brittle around the edges. "The owner? Surely he wouldn't be mingling just anywhere. Someone like that would have made his presence known." But her words sounded hollow now. The name rippled through the deck like a wave. Williams. Williams, some guests whispered, others muttered. Slowly, realization began to creep into their minds. The man they had just seen escorted away, the stranger mocked for his modest suit, the one who had stood so calmly in the face of humiliation. He had introduced himself to no one, but his demeanor. It suddenly made sense. A guest near the rail gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. "The man," she whispered, voice trembling. "The one she expelled. That was him." Her companion's eyes widened. No, it couldn't. But even as he spoke, he knew it was true. The coordinator, catching fragments of their whispers, stiffened. His gaze darted toward the yacht's exit where the man had last stood. His face blanched. "What do you mean, expelled? Mr. Williams was here? He was on deck?" The murmurs swelled into an uproar. Gasps punctuated the air like sudden sparks. Some guests pressed hands to their chests, mortified. Others shook their heads in disbelief, recalling the poised calm of the man they had dismissed. And at the center of it all, the hostess froze. Her smirk vanished, draining into shock. The color fled from her cheeks, leaving her face pale as porcelain. Her lips parted, but no words came. Only silence clung to her, heavy and suffocating. The images replayed in her mind with brutal clarity. His steady gaze, the subtle weight of his questions, the way he'd looked at the yacht as though it were his own. She had thought it arrogance. Now she saw the truth, ownership woven into every quiet gesture. Her knees wobbled, though she fought to stand tall. The eyes of the guests shifted toward her, sharp with judgment. The very crowd that had once chuckled along with her mockery now watched with disdain, their laughter curdling into scorn. Whispers hissed like daggers. She humiliated him. In front of everyone. And he's the owner, our host. The hostess clasped her hands together tightly, as though she could hold herself from unraveling. But inside, her confidence had already shattered into 1,000 shards. The coordinator's voice cut through again, firm and unforgiving. Mr. Williams trusted us to welcome his guests with grace. And instead, his words faltered as his gaze landed squarely on the hostess. Instead, he was cast out of his own gathering. A heavy silence blanketed the deck. Even the sea seemed to hush, the music faltering into awkward quiet. The weight of realization pressed down on every soul present. For the guests, shame seeped in. They had laughed at him, smirked, whispered. They had mistaken dignity for weakness, modesty for intrusion. For the hostess, it was far worse. Her pride, her arrogance, her carefully polished veneer, all of it lay in ruins. She had mocked a man whose very presence should have been met with reverence. She had stripped him of honor in front of his peers, only to discover he was the only one who had ever truly owned it. And though he was no longer standing among them, his absence loomed larger than any presence could dot. It was not humiliation he had carried away. It was theirs. The murmurs still rippled through the air like restless waves when a sudden hush fell across the deck. It was not demanded. Not ordered. Silence arrived as though the very sea itself had drawn a collective breath. At the edge of the deck, framed by the fading glow of the afternoon sun, James Williams stepped back aboard. Gone was the quiet figure whom the hostess had mocked. Though he wore the same modest suit, something about his presence had shifted. It radiated authority without force, dignity without arrogance. Every step he took across the polished wood commanded attention. The laughter that had earlier filled the air died instantly, as though no one dared to dishonor the moment with sound. The hostess froze where she stood, her skin pale, her lips trembling. She clutched the stem of her champagne glass so tightly it threatened to shatter. Mr. Williams did not glance at her immediately. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the crowd, meeting gaze after gaze, allowing each guest to see themselves in the calm reflection of his composure. Some lowered their eyes, shame flooding their cheeks. Others shifted uncomfortably, as though his silence alone had held up a mirror too clear to bear. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. Yet each word landed with a weight far heavier than if he had shouted, "Respect." He began, his tone even, should never be measured by appearance. The words hung in the air, still and deliberate. A few guests inhaled sharply, their guilt laid bare in the quiet between syllables. True dignity, he continued, his gaze steady now on the hostess, is revealed in how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. The hostess flinched under the weight of his calm rebuke. Her once bright confidence crumbled, leaving her standing exposed, her pride stripped bare in front of the very people she had sought to impress. Mr. Williams shifted his gaze from her to the rest of the gathering. This yacht, this event, these things mean nothing if they are built on vanity and arrogance. Wealth is not power. Privilege is not worth. The only thing that defines us, his voice softened, almost sorrowful, is how we choose to treat the people we meet, no matter who they are. No one dared to move. The music had long since ceased. Even the sea breeze seemed to quiet, as though unwilling to interrupt the moment. Guests who had laughed at him now stared at the ground, their champagne untouched, their jewels untailored. Suits feeling suddenly heavy, meaningless against the simplicity of his truth. They remembered their smirks, their whispered jabs, their indulgence in the hostess's mockery. Shame gnawed at them, relentless. The hostess tried to speak, her voice breaking in her throat. I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." Mr. Williams raised a hand gently, not in anger, but in refusal. His eyes softened, though his tone remained firm. "And that is exactly the lesson. Respect should not depend on knowing someone's name, their title, their wealth. It should be offered freely, because it is the right thing to do." Her words died on her lips. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but no apology could undo what had already been revealed. Williams let the silence stretch once more, the weight of his wisdom sinking deep into the hearts of every guest present. Then, with a quiet grace, he straightened his shoulders, his presence unshaken. "I do not need to raise my voice to be heard," he said finally. "I only ask that you remember, every encounter is an opportunity, either to uplift or to diminish, to honor or to humiliate. And each choice you make tells the world more about you than about the person standing before you." The guests could not applaud. It would have felt wrong, cheap, after what had transpired. Instead, they stood in reverent silence, some with heads bowed, others blinking back tears, all of them chastened by the humility of the very man they had dismissed. As Williams turned slightly, the golden sunlight caught the edges of his face, painting him in quiet majesty. In that moment, it was not the wealth of a billionaire that commanded respect. It was the unshakable dignity of a man who chose wisdom over pride. And in their silence, the guests realized they had been given something greater than a lavish party. They had been given a lesson they would carry long after the music faded and the yacht returned to shore. The silence on the yacht was suffocating, heavy enough that even the clinking of waves against the hull seemed muted. No one moved. No one dared to speak. The hostess stood frozen, her carefully crafted mask of confidence shattered into fragments. Her lips trembled as she searched for words, her hands clutching at the folds of her dress, as though fabric alone could anchor her dignity. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice breaking, thin and uneven. "Mr. Williams, please. I thought—" The words tangled on her tongue, collapsing under the weight of her own shame. The man who had endured her mockery only hours or perhaps minutes ago stood before her unchanged, his composure steady as the sea itself. James Williams did not gloat, he did not sneer. He did not mirror the arrogance she had wielded against him. Instead, he regarded her with a calm so profound it stripped her excuses bare. When he finally spoke, his tone was quiet, even merciful, yet undeniable in its authority. "You thought my worth could be measured by my clothes," he said, his gaze fixed firmly on her. "You thought respect could be withheld until you knew a name, a title, a fortune, but dignity, true dignity, is not something to be granted and revoked at whim. It is a constant. And you chose to deny it." Her knees buckled slightly, and she stepped forward, desperate now. "Please, I didn't mean if I had known you were the owner. I never would have." Williams raised his hand, silencing her instantly. His expression did not soften, though his voice remained calm. "And that," he said, his words cutting deeper than anger ever could, "is the problem. Respect given only to the powerful is not respect at all. It is fear, it is greed. And I will not allow it to take root here." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet his gaze. Others tightened their grip on champagne flutes that had long since lost their taste. The weight of their own complicity pressed against their hearts. They had laughed. They had joined in her mockery. They, too, had judged without knowing. Williams turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over them all. For a moment, each guest felt as though his eyes lingered on them in particular, a silent mirror reflecting back their own shame. Finally, he looked once more at the trembling hostess. Her face was pale, her body rigid with dread. She knew what was coming before he spoke, and yet the finality of his words struck like a bell in the silence. "Leave this yacht." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The hostess's eyes widened, her breath catching. "Please, no, don't. "There's no room for arrogance or disrespect in my presence," he continued, his voice firm but not cruel. "This yacht is not a stage for vanity. It is a place for people to gather with dignity. You have shown none, and for that, you must go." The words fell like a verdict, irrevocable. The hostess swayed slightly, her chest heaving as she looked around desperately, searching for sympathy in the eyes of those who had once cheered her on. But the crowd was silent. No one rushed to defend her. No one offered comfort. Where moments ago they had laughed with her, now they stood apart, unwilling to share her fate. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back, unwilling to let them fall. With trembling hands, she set her champagne glass down on the nearest table, the crystal clinking faintly against the polished surface. Slowly she turned, her heels clicking hollowly against the deck as she walked toward the exit. Every step she took felt like an eternity. The guests parted quietly, giving her a wide berth, their silence heavier than condemnation. She passed through them like a ghost, her arrogance dissolved, her pride in ruins. When at last she disappeared beyond the rail, the deck was left in an almost sacred quiet. The guests remained still, their faces marked with shame, some with regret, others with awe at the man who had revealed so much without ever raising his voice. Williams let the silence linger. Then, with a slow breath, he turned back to his guests. His expression remained calm, though his eyes carried the weight of what had just transpired. "This is not about humiliation," he said, his voice steady. "It is about learning. Each of you has seen today how easily respect can be lost when it is tied only to wealth or appearance. Let this be a reminder to honor others not for what they have, but for who they are." The guests bowed their heads, chastened. No one dared to argue. No one dared to dismiss the truth. And in that moment, the arrogance that had once stained the air seemed to dissolve into something else entirely: humility, fragile but genuine, carried on the hush of the sea breeze. The evening sun stretched its last rays across the horizon, turning the waters into sheets of molten gold. The laughter and music that had once filled the yacht were hushed now, replaced by a quiet reverence. Every guest stood in silence, as though the sea itself had demanded their reflection. James Williams remained at the center of the deck, his presence calm, steady, unshaken. He did not bask in triumph, nor revel in vindication. Instead, he stood with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to prove. His words and actions had spoken louder than any declaration of power could. The guests, adorned in glittering jewels and tailored suits, shifted uneasily. Their finery suddenly felt like masks, fragile, shallow, meaningless compared to the strength of character that had just humbled them. Shame lingered in their eyes, but so too did something else: understanding. For once, the arrogance that so often clung to gatherings of wealth had been stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of human nature. The image of the hostess walking off the yacht lingered in their minds, a stark reminder of how quickly pride could crumble when built on shallow ground. But Williams's lesson had not been for her alone. It was for them all. The narrator's voice rose gently, carrying the weight of what had unfolded. Arrogance blinds the heart, while respect opens doors. The words hung in the air, as if carried on the wind, weaving through the silence. Guests glanced at one another, some bowing their heads, others closing their eyes in thought. They knew the truth of it now, for they had seen it with their own eyes. Wealth may impress. The voice continued, steady and clear, but humility defines true greatness. On the deck, Mr. Williams clasped his hands behind his back, his gaze sweeping once more over the horizon. He looked not like a billionaire flaunting power, but like a man at peace with himself, untouchable by vanity, untouched by the shallow judgments of others. "Always remember," the narrator pressed on, "appearances can deceive, but character will always reveal the truth." The lesson struck deep. Guests who had once chuckled at Williams's expense now felt the sting of their own arrogance. They thought of how quickly they had judged, how easily they had sided with cruelty. And they knew they would carry this moment far beyond the yacht, back into boardrooms, into homes, into their daily lives where arrogance too often went unchecked. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with hues of crimson and violet, Williams turned away from the crowd. He did not need applause. He did not seek their approval. His presence alone had left an indelible mark. The yacht, once a stage for spectacle, had become something else entirely. A place where pride was stripped bare, where truth was revealed, where humility stood taller than wealth. And as the waves rocked gently against the hull, the guests stood in silence, hearts heavy with realization, spirits softened by wisdom. For on that golden evening, they had learned that true greatness does not shout, does not boast, does not humiliate. It simply endures.